Ozzy Osbourne first met Eddie Van Halen when Van Halen toured with Black Sabbath as their openers in 1978. Every time Van Halen kicked the roof off, and it was really hard for Black Sabbath to play after them. And it was then Ozzy realized that it was over for Black Sabbath, and he left the band in 1979. Ozzy remembers how amazing Eddie Van Halen was on guitar. "I could sit and watch Eddie Van Halen play guitar all day," says Ozzy. "He's so entertaining as a guitar player. He made it look like it was not difficult. He made it look like it was a natural thing. Everybody else was trying to be Eddie Van Halen. But there is only one Eddie Van Halen. I thought he was brilliant. God only knows what you have to do to get that good." So Ozzy left Black Sabbath to form his own band, and he knew that he needed a guitar player who could do what Eddie did on the guitar. He needed a modern sound for the band because bands like Black Sabbath and Rainbow were becoming obsolete in the late 70s. So Ozzy left England and moved to Los Angeles, California. He lived in a suite at Le Parc Hotel in West Hollywood. At the time, he didn't have a record deal. He had a manager, Don Arden. Don Arden signed him to Jet Records with the aim of recording new material. Arden dispatched his daughter Sharon to Los Angeles to look after Ozzy's needs, whatever they were, to protect his investment. So Sharon Arden, who later became Sharon Osbourne, worked for her father, Don Arden, who ran Jet Records, and she was helping Ozzy to put a band together. Actually, Sharon was a big fan of Van Halen and followed the career since the early days. This is what Sharon revealed on CBS Daytime Talk Show in 2020. "I was lucky enough to know him, been following his career for so long, since before they even got signed. Van Halen used to have a residency at the Whiskey on Sunset. Once a week, I used to go see him. Just an amazing, amazing band. Eddie and his brother. I mean, just phenomenal. But Ozzy knew him much better, obviously being a fellow musician, and they toured the world together. Van Halen's first big tour was supporting Black Sabbath, and they went around the world with Sabbath. When they were in England, touring England, Ozzy took them to his local pub. And the pub was in the middle of the countryside where Ozzy lived. And it was full of farmers and local people. And Van Halen, he took them into the pub, and of course, they didn't understand what anybody said. I can only imagine their thoughts. They must have been like, "Are we in the Twilight Zone? Young guys from Pasadena and Los Angeles going to an old English pub in the middle of nowhere?" But Eddie was always funny and nice. So when Sharon was helping Ozzy to form a supergroup, she wanted an amazing player with explosive style like Eddie Van Halen, who could play all those cool modern guitar tricks. So she wanted to get Gary Moore in the band, who left Thin Lizzy in 1979 and relocated to Los Angeles, where he signed a new recording contract with Jet Records, ran by Sharon's father, Don Arden. Gary Moore could play fast with feel and emotion, had great sound, and knew how to do cool tricks on guitar. And Gary Moore was actually friends with Eddie Van Halen. Gary Moore first saw Van Halen in 1978 when Van Halen was on tour with Black Sabbath. According to Thin Lizzy guitarist Scott Gorham, he and Gary Moore were just blown away by Eddie Van Halen's guitar playing. They loved the performance and the energy which Van Halen gave to the audience. Phil Lynott, Scott Gorham, and Gary Moore saw Van Halen at Detroit's Cobo Arena on September 14, 1978. According to Scott Gorham, Van Halen came on and blew everyone off. Scott recalls, "They were amazing. When Eddie started doing his tapping thing, I turned around to Gary and said, 'What is that? What is he doing?' Gary was just staring at him and he said, 'I don't know.' 10 minutes later, I went to ask Gary another question and he was gone. The next day, I was standing in his hotel room and he said, 'Hey, check this out.' And he started tapping away. He'd gone back to the hotel the night before to teach himself how to do it. So, in 1979, when Thin Lizzy were touring the United States, Gary Moore suddenly dropped the band halfway through the tour and disappeared. Apparently, seeing Van Halen's success made Gary Moore drop Thin Lizzy and start his solo project. Jet Records promised Gary the opportunity to tour the United States in support of Van Halen. In Los Angeles, Gary Moore befriended Eddie Van Halen and they hung out together. So Sharon attempted to convince Ozzy to form a band with Gary Moore, but Gary Moore wanted to do his own project, G-Force. When I lived in Los Angeles, Moore recalls, G-Force helped Ozzy to audition musicians. If drummers were trying out, I'd play guitar. And if bassists came along, my drummer would help out. We felt sorry for Ozzy. He was always hovering around, trying to get me to join, and I wasn't having any of it. Bass player Dana Strum, who played in Vinnie Vincent Invasion in the 80s, was the one who made Ozzy get Randy Rhoads in the band. Randy actually knew how to play those tricks which Eddie did on guitar and used to teach kids how to play Van Halen songs. So this is what Dana recalls. I played in a local band at the Starwood. That was the place. Everybody played there. Van Halen played there. Quiet Riot played there with Randy. I saw this guy who was very thin. He used Mick Ronson as his influence, from the polka dots he wore to the Les Paul he played. I approached him. I said, I know we're both just in local bands, but it seems that there has to be a way for you to go further than what we're all doing. Not even a week later, I get this phone call from a girl called Sharon Arden, who became Sharon Osbourne. She said she had this ex-singer from Black Sabbath who wanted to see my Starwood show. And when I heard that, my heart started pumping because that was high school hero time. He came up right after my gig and announced that I was in his band in front of my band. I went to his hotel room and I met him. I was starstruck, but he was going through a pretty bad time, so it was pretty devastating to see my idol crawling around on the floor in a haze. Anyway, I suggested Randy right away as a guitar player, and I was shot down immediately. Ozzy wanted to get Gary Moore. I only knew he was some guy from Thin Lizzy. I was blown away when I saw Gary. He was the fastest, most blazing lead guitar player I've ever seen. I knew Randy Rhoads didn't play like that, but I knew he had something. I never laid off my gut instinct. Gary Moore and Ozzy didn't hit it off. They lasted 2 weeks. We saw Chris Holmes from Wasp. We saw a guy who sang Jimi Hendrix to Ozzy. We looked at all kinds of guys. Finally, I got Ozzy to agree to listen to Randy. I called and asked him if he'd ever heard of Black Sabbath. He was not at all familiar with the music, but I got him down to a studio with his old Gibson practice amp, his old 6-band equalizer, and Les Paul. By the time we got to the studio, Ozzy fell asleep. I knew Randy would bowl him over. I was so determined that I would lose my own gig, and I did. I pulled Ozzy into the control room and made him listen. Randy said, I've never auditioned for anybody. What do I do? I told him to play a solo from his Starwood gig. You could hear all the harmonics and bending of his playing in that one piece. So Ozzy heard about 30 or 60 seconds of it and he said, "Tell him he's got the gig." That was it. So years later, Ozzy would recall that night. I'm lying over the studio desk and Dana keeps throwing water and stuff all over me. And I look through the studio window and Randy says something like, softly spoken voice, "What do you want me to play?" I say, "Do you got a solo?" He says, "Well, kinda." I say, "Well, play anything." He had a little tiny amp he played and I just went, "What?" I remember thinking in my haze, this is not really happening. I'm asleep really, because this guy, you hadn't heard stuff like this before. Ozzy once said there was a rivalry between Randy and Eddie, but there were some interviews where Randy Rhoads compliments Eddie Van Halen and admits using similar guitar tricks. On the 2nd of February 1982, Greensburg, Pennsylvania, a fan asked Randy Rhoads at a guitar clinic, "Fan, I've heard a lot of rumors that you're like just copying off Eddie Van Halen. Were you influenced by him, his technique in playing?" Crowd makes, comments to fan. "No, was your influence, by him?" And Randy Rhoads, "Yeah, I actually was." Audio producer Max Norman, who worked on Blizzard of Oz in 1980, recalled, "Van Halen was one of the few guitarists Randy would talk about. One day I asked him, 'What guitar players do you like, Randy?' And he said, 'I like Eddie Van Halen.' Randy's friend Rudy Sarzo said later on he came to really admire Gary Moore and Eddie Van Halen. Those were his top two guys." In a 1982 interview with Guitar World, Randy explained, "I have my own personality on the guitar, but as of yet, I don't think I have my own style," Rhoads explained. "For instance, I do a solo thing in concert and I do like the same licks as Eddie Van Halen. Eddie's a great player, but it kills me that I do that. For me, it's just flash that impresses the kids. I'm trying to make a name for myself as fast as I can. I wish I could take time and come up with something that nobody else has done, but that's going to take a few years."